Today we're going to build a category section for the website we've been making up until now. So of course this is something that is going to work for all websites, but if you're following this particular lesson here, this is what we should have so far. We have a header at the top of the website that is going to follow as we scroll down, and that you will actually get to see in this video since we're actually going to start creating more content further down below the page. And we do also have a hero section, which right now just sort of like links to my work somewhere inside a sub page that we haven't created yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to build this category section, and it should be a little bit faster than the previous episode with the hero section because it's less artistic than what we did up here, because there was some moving around and we wanted to shift this paragraph further over than this paragraph, and there was a little bit of artistic stuff going on in this particular lesson there. So by now you should actually know how to do this pretty well. So we're going to go back inside our text editor, and I'm going to go down to where we have the hero section inside this page. As you can see, I did actually create a couple of comments inside my document here. We haven't talked about comments yet, but the way you create a comment is essentially by saying lesser than, exclamation mark, dash dash, and then you close it off with a dash dash greater than. So you can just sort of like write anything in between these, and that will be a comment that you don't actually get to see inside the website. So if you want to create comments, that's how you can do it. Same way if you go inside our CSS file, the way you create a comment is by saying / multiplication, and then multiplication / to end it off again. So you can write anything in between these two different ones here, and that is going to be a comment. So now you know how to do that. But having said that, let's actually go ahead and go back in here, and let's take this comment, go below our hero section, paste it in, and let's go ahead and create a comment that says the category section of this website. Is that how you spell it in English? I think it's with a C. Right? Because we're not in Denmark right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a section tag. And inside this section tag, I am going to give it a class. So we're going to say this has a class. And this one is going to be set to index-category. The reason I decided to name it like this is just to tell me that this is inside my index page inside my website, and this is the category section inside this website here. You could, of course, if you want to take this particular section and you want to use it multiple other places and other pages, give it a more generic name so you can just reuse it again and again. But for the sake of this tutorial here, let's just go ahead and give it a index-category, not with a K this time around. Now, the way I want to create this little category section is by having 4 different squares next to each other that are going to have an image inside of them, so a background image and a piece of text that is going to be centered inside the box. And I want to have these lead to a separate category depending on, what they say essentially inside the image and inside the text. So what I can do is I will start by just creating one of the boxes. So I'm going to create a div box here, and I'm going to be naming this one a class called index-category-box or something. Just something that makes sense to you. Inside the box itself, we're going to go ahead and insert a piece of text since I want this to actually lead my user somewhere. And this is where you need to consider if this is going to be a paragraph or if this is going to be a header. And really the thing about making headers and paragraphs is that there's no fixed rule of thumb on what you should do and what you should not do, since it really depends on the page and the website you're trying to create. Like, how important is it that Google knows about these categories here? Is it a minor little detail inside the website, or is it a extremely important thing because you're trying to sell something here? In this case here, let's go ahead and create a H3 tag, because I do think that when it comes to trying to sell myself as a web developer for some sort of service, that it's important that Google knows what kind of services I offer when it comes to being a freelancer. So what I can do is I can just insert any kind of text inside the H3, of course, a category name or something. So what I'll insert here in the first one is web development. And for now, this is actually pretty much what we need. So what I can do is I can go inside my index.css, because remember, we do have a main.css for the overall styling of, all the pages inside the website, but we do also have a page specific styling. So inside my index.css, I'm going to go down to the very bottom. And what I could do is I could actually divide this up into different categories. So I could write a comment, and inside this comment here, I can go ahead and say the category, and I just misspelled that in the Danish way again. So category section just so we know exactly when this CSS starts inside the CSS file. And I can go and say we have a class called index-category, open up the curly brackets, and I'm going to copy this one, paste it below, and I'm going to say we have an index category dash box. So now we can actually target these two. We could also go ahead and just say, you know what, let's take this category box and also say we have an h3 inside one of these. And again, you could also go inside your main.css, and at the very top here, where we do have a default styling of an h1, I could actually copy paste this. So we create some default styling for an h3 as well. We could do an h2 and then go down, paste in, and a h3, just so we have all these three different headers in here with some default styling. So with this, I can actually go back inside my index.css. And we do already have some default styling now for the h3. And if I want to make any sort of changes to this text, I can do it inside these curly brackets here. So what I want to do for the category itself is I actually want it to stretch from left to right, so the entire width of my browser right now. So inside the category, I'm going to say we have a width. I'm going to set this one to 100%. And I'm also going to go ahead and set a padding. I'm not going to set a height because the height is going to vary depending on how big the content inside the actual section here is. So we don't want to set a fixed height, because then we have to readjust the height every single time we make any sort of adjustments to any content inside this container here. But I do want to set a padding, and I'm going to set it to 60 pixels just to test with at the start here from top and bottom, and 0 from left and right, meaning that we do have some distance at the top and bottom of the content inside this container here. What I can also do is I can give this one a background color. Let's actually just go and set this one to white for now. So FFF. And with that, we can actually start styling the box that we want to have inside the container. So what I can do is I can say that the box should have a certain width. Again, we can just decide on anything here that you think might look good. Let's start with 120 pixels and see where that takes us for now. Then I'll go below, give it a height, which is going to be 120 pixels. Now at this point, we could actually do something a little bit different depending on how you want to style things. I could just go in and say that I want to use a flex box inside the box here to place my h3 inside the box. So we just basically use flex box for that. Or as we learned in one of the previous videos, we can actually set a line height, just like we did inside the header inside the website. So if the header is 60 pixels tall, I can also set a line height to 60 pixels to center it inside the container. And that is going to work unless this is going to be on two separate lines. So if I were to say, you know what, let's add a break in here and put this on two separate lines, then all of a sudden these two lines are going to be very far apart. So depending on what we want to do here, we either need to use the line height or we need to use Flexbox to place the content. Now, I do think that Flexbox is going to be the safest way to do it, because it's going to give us it's going to allow for us to style things the same way inside the entire website. So if I were to use line height here, then some elements inside the website are using line height and other elements are not using line height. So, you know, we want to make sure we're consistent along the website here. So inside my style sheet again, I'm going to go down and give this a background color just so we can see it. I'm just going to set it to red for now. Save it, and let's actually go and see how this looks like inside the website. So I've refreshed the page, and as you can see, we can now scroll. So if I scroll down, you can actually see, oh, now we have some content here with 60 pixels of spacing from top and bottom, and it has web development inside of it. Now, I do think that the box is quite tiny. I do want to have it a little bit bigger, so maybe 160 pixels. And this is really one of the moments where either you have a design made ahead of time, or you just kind of experiment a little bit with it to see how it's going to look like. So we refresh it. I think this is a little bit more like how I want it to inside this website here. So what I can do, I can readjust the text, because right now it's not actually fitting inside, and it is quite big. I don't want it to be this big. So going back inside of H3 styling here, inside this page specific styling, I can go down and give it a font size, which should be a little bit smaller than the default one, which is right now 26 pixels. So let's go ahead and make this one 22, just to see how that looks like. So if I refresh the page, you can now see that it fits a little bit better in here, but it's still quite big. And at this point, we can choose to just continue making the text a little bit smaller, or I can make the box a little bit bigger. In this example here, I do think I want to make the text a little bit smaller. So let's actually go ahead and go in here and say we want to have it 18 pixels instead. Go back inside the website, and that's more like it. And at this point here, we can pretty much tell what we're going to do, whether or not to use flexbox or line height to censor the text inside the container, which is, of course, we want to make sure we use flexbox, because right now we do need to adjust the line height. So I do go back inside my CSS and say I want to have a line height, and I want to set this one to, let's try 24 pixels and see how that looks like. Going back in, refresh. You can see it gets a little bit smaller and a little bit better now. I know you can, I'm kind of like hiding the concept behind my face cam here, but you should be able to see just a little bit of it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back inside my index page, and I'm actually going to duplicate this 3 more times, just the box part inside this container here. So we're going to have 4 of them in total. And I'm just going to go and change the content, or at least the text inside the content, depending on what I want to show the person inside this website here. So let's say the first one is going to be web development. The second one is going to be movie production. I do already have some photos that I downloaded off the internet, and I will leave a link to a website where you can also download free photos. But essentially inside my images folder, I have a categories folder. And inside this one, I have editing, filming, photo, and programming. So what I can do for the next one is I can say film editing. And then the last one could, for example, be Photoshop, just to have something in one word. With this change, we can go back inside the website, and I know it is kind of hidden behind my face cam, but as you can see, everything goes below each other. And this is where we need to start using Flexbox, because we need to tell it how the flow of the website needs to be inside our page here. So going inside the index page, I can go inside the main container, which is index category. I'm going to set display to flex. And I want to tell it that I want to justify content, and I want to center it because I want to have it centered inside the website. So just by doing this, you can now see that everything is going to be centered down here. But I do want to have a little bit of spacing in between them. So I'm going to go back inside my CSS here and say I want to have a gap. And this one is going to be a column gap, since we don't need to have anything on the row below. And I'm going to set this one to 20 pixels just to try it out. So we're going to do that. Refresh. And as you can see, we have a little bit of a gap in between. And this is really the moment where you can do whatever you want here. If you think that this is too little or too much, then of course you can just keep increasing or decreasing. Maybe the boxes are also too small for you. You can just do that as well. Personally, I might want to increase the boxes just a little bit here. So I want to go down and say that instead of 160, I might want to have it 200. And I'm going to make sure I do that both places. Go back in here. And with that, we might actually be able to also increase the text a little bit more. So I could also go in and say I want to increase the text to, again, 22, and maybe the line height to 28, just to test it out. Saving, refreshing, and there we go. Now, at this point here, we can do a couple of things, because we do have something called BEM inside CSS styling, which is a naming convention, which stands for block element modifier. And essentially, this is a way to name our CSS in a way that makes sense. So if another person were to pick up your project and had to continue writing CSS for this particular website here, it would make sense to them what you've written inside your CSS because of the way you named it and what exactly each CSS styling actually does. Let's not do that for now in this episode here, because I do think that BEM is a completely separate subject in itself. So let's actually go ahead and just do something called nth child. So inside my CSS, I'm going to copy paste my category box. I'm going to paste it below, delete all the styling inside of it, and just go ahead and create a new one called background-image. I'm going to set a URL, parentheses, and inside the naming for this one, I'm going to say colon nth child. And then I'm going to write 1 to indicate that this is going to be the first div with this class inside the container up here. And with this sort of naming, we can go inside the URL, go back 1 directory to make sure that we can actually access our image folder, because right now we're inside a CSS folder. So we have to go back 1 directory, then go inside the image folder, then go inside the categories folder. And for the first one here, since we know what is inside the HTML, I'm going to grab my programming image, which is going to be the web development category that I have. So with this one, I can actually go back inside, refresh it. And as you can see, we now have a background image for the first child inside this main container here. So now you may have guessed it. We're going to copy paste this one, paste it below, and I'm going to change the URL. So it's not programming, but instead, it is going to be my filming, because I think that's the next one. Then I'm going to copy paste it down. I am going to change this one to not programming, but editing. Then I'm going to paste it down and create one for my Photoshop. So again, just going to grab my photo.png, and I'm just going to change all the different childs in here. So the second one, the third one, and the fourth one are going to have these images here. So with that, we can go back in here, and as you can see, now they all have different styling. However, they are scaled wrong because the background images don't have any sort of background scaling. So I'm going to go back inside my index category box up here. I'm going to make the color into a darker version. So we could just go ahead and say 111, just to give it some sort of background color. So if one of these images fail, then we do still have a background color to fill in that sort of sense. I can also go down, say that my background dash repeat is going to be no repeat. And I'm also going to go ahead and say that I want my background dash size to be cover. So if I were to do that, go back in here, you can now see that everything is going to fit accordingly. So everything is not scaled up in any sort of weird sense. The next thing we're going to do is make sure that the text is actually centered inside these containers here. So going back inside our styling, I can go inside my box container and also give this one a display as flex. With this one, I can now say I want to justify content and I want to center it inside my container here. And I also want to say align items a certain way. So I could also say this one is going to be centered, which is the vertical axis. So having centered it both ways now, going in to refresh it, you can now see that everything is going to be centered. Now, the reason web development and movie production is not being centered right now is actually because if we were to inspect this as a element, you can see that because it's jumping down on 2 lines, it is actually going all the way to the edge, going down to next line to finish off the sentence. This is not quite going to work for these particular ones here. What you can do is you can go inside your H3 styling down here and say you want to text align center. Do that. Refresh the website. Make sure we actually close this down. And now I can see everything is centered. And just to point it out here, notice how the header at the top is staying with the website even though we're scrolling. I just think that's important to show since we actually did some styling to make it stay up there. Another thing we can actually do to this styling here if you wanted to, because right now the text isn't quite like inside Photoshop here, it's kind of blending in with the background a little bit. So what you could do if you wanted to is you can give it a couple of effects inside our styling here. So if I were to go down to my index category H3, I can say text shadow, and actually give it a drop down shadow. So we have a little bit of, darkness going on below the text so we can see it. The first one is going to be how we want to move it on the vertical, the horizontal axis. So I could say we want to have it, let's do 0 pixels for now, and say that for the vertical axis, I want to move it down a certain amount. So -4 pixels. Then I'm going to give it a blur effect. Let's actually go ahead and leave it out for now, just so we can see what is going on here. And then a color. So I can say hashtag 000, which is a black color, as black as it gets, essentially. So going in here, refreshing, you can now see that we have kind of like this drop down shadow effect. In this case here, I should not have set my y-axis to minus. So let's actually go ahead and fix that. And in this sort of way, you can see the drop shadow there. Let's go ahead and change a little bit. So instead of having it 4, let's go ahead and set it to 2. Give it a blur effect. So maybe like 4. And let's give it a -2 on the x-axis. So let's do that, refresh it. And now I can see we have just a little bit of a shadow effect when it comes to these pieces of text here. The Photoshop gets a little bit more visible if that's what we want. Let's also go ahead and create a category section because right now we don't actually have a header for this section. So inside our index page, I will go inside my index category and say that I want to add a paragraph since I don't really think this is much of a important header. And I'm just going to go ahead and name this one categories. We could also make this all caps, but we can also change that using CSS. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So inside my CSS file, I can go down to where we have this container. So index-category. I'm going to copy paste it down and say I want to target the paragraph inside of here. And just like with the last one, we do already have some default styling for our paragraphs inside of here. So we only need to make the changes that we want to see inside the website. So for example, setting the color to a dark color instead of having it as white. So I could say this one should be 111, which is a very dark gray color. I do also want to center my text. So I could say text align center, and maybe add a padding at the bottom. So we have a little bit of distance down to the category squares that we have in here. So padding bottom. I'm going to set this one to 40 pixels for now, just to see how it looks like. So with this one, I can go back in here, refresh. But as you can see, the paragraph is actually being displayed in line with everything inside the container here, because everything inside the parent container is going to have the flex applied to it. So how can we fix that? A couple of different ways you can do it is if you were to go inside our HTML. So right now, as you can see, we have the paragraph here, and then we have all these different divs that are all going to be affected by the flex that we applied to the parent container here. So either we can move out the paragraph outside the parent container, which means that we would have to actually start changing some things inside the CSS and redo some of the things that we've done so far. Or we can go and say that the category should take up 100% of the width inside the first row inside this particular container here. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside the index file, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be adding a flex basis and say that I want to have this one be 100% of the width available inside the browser. So right now the paragraph is going to take up 100% of the width. However, something is going to happen here, which is that you'll actually notice that all the content is trying to like squeeze itself in inside this page here. So right now the categories is taking up 100% of the width of the browser, but it's also pushing everything else. So what we can do is we can actually tell it that the content inside this flex here is allowed to wrap. So we can say flex wrap is going to be set to wrap. And with this one, we can go back inside the browser, refresh, and now I can see that, oh, okay, so with 100% width, there's no more space for these other categories, so we're gonna wrap them down to the next line. And just like that, we now have everything like we wanted to inside this categories container here. Now we do, of course, want to apply some styling to the text here, since categories is quite small and, you know, it's not capitalized, it's not anything. So let's go back in here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some text transform and say I want to make it all uppercase. I'm also going to go and change the font size. So in this case here, we could actually go ahead and make it, let's make it 28 pixels just to see how that looks like. And with that, we can go back inside. We can save it, and now I can see we get something a little bit bigger. And again, it might look a little bit weird that it's just like slightly bigger than the text inside the boxes here, so we could make it the same font size if we wanted to. So right now we do have the H3 down here, which is right now 22 pixels in font size. So we could do the exact same thing up here and give it a 22 pixel font size if you want to do that. And then you can see all of a sudden it looks a little bit more clean, I think, when it's not completely different from these down here. Again, you can style it however you want to, because the world is yours when it comes to CSS, and you can make it however pretty you want to have it inside your project here. And now, again, this is one of the benefits to using the BEM system, because you can actually notice a small error happening here. Because we decided not to use the BEM naming convention in order to name some of the CSS stylings in here, but instead use the nth child, you'll now notice that the categories up here is actually receiving the background image that should be for the first one down here called web development. And everything is shifting one back because this is also a child inside this container here. So the background element is not really being applied for Photoshop in this case here. So again, one way to fix it would be to actually use the BEM naming convention, or we can go in and actually change the naming. So instead of, 1, 2, 3, and 4, it is going to be 2, 3, 4, and 5. So saving this, going inside the browser, refreshing, everything is now back to normal. The next thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I can actually click these boxes. So I can actually click on Photoshop and be taken to my Photoshop cases, or click on the web development and be taken to the web development cases. Because right now we don't actually have any sort of links that can actually take us anywhere. So going inside the HTML page, what we can do is we can actually do this in a very simple way, since we want to make sure we don't overcomplicate things as much as possible. So instead of wrapping our div boxes inside anchor tags, which we could do, we could go in here and say we have a anchor tag, and then we just put the div box inside. So we just delete and put it in here just like so. And then we have a anchor tag around the div boxes. But that is going to mess things up a little bit for us, because then we have to start, moving the classes into the anchor tags instead. And we start getting to a place where we can actually make this a lot simpler. So instead of creating these extra anchor tags, what I can do is I can actually just convert my div tags to an anchor tag, because a anchor tag can behave in the same way as a div can. So I can just simply go in here and say that instead of a div, I have a anchor tag. We want to make sure we include the hyperreference attribute as well. And I just want to link to hashtags, since we don't actually have any place to take them right now. So we just want to insert a placeholder. And then I want to make sure we do also close off the anchor tag instead of the div. So with this, we can just copy paste. So I'm just going to copy, paste, and paste, and paste. And of course, do the same thing for the closing tag, so we don't have divs closing off. And just like this, we can actually, in a very simple way, go inside our website, refresh it, and as you can see, everything looks the same. But when I go down to them, we get this little hand icon to show that we can actually click them. And we do get taken to the same page with a hashtag inside the URL. And that's because, like I said, we're just including a placeholder for now, so we don't actually have any pages to take them to. But this is the most simple way to just sort of like include an anchor tag. The next thing I want to do, which is the last thing, is that right now, my image is not really the best images to use inside this website here. Like, I just picked some random images that kind of had something to do with the different categories down here. You might have picked some better images than I did. But what I want to do is I want to make sure that when I put my mouse cursor on top of these boxes, something happens. We want to have some user feedback. We want to have that snappy effect when it comes to interacting with the website, because right now it's just very static. Like, there's nothing going on. We can scroll. The menu does have some snappiness. So when we do actually do something with the menu, like a hover effect or something happens. So we want to make sure that something happens with these different categories. What I think would be cool to do would be to add a dark overlay that sort of like hides the background just a little bit in, like a black overlay. And then when we hover on top of it, it's going to remove the overlay and just show the full image below. So we have something going on in there. And when it comes to creating this sort of like overlay effect, there is many ways you can do it. Like, I'm not even kidding. There's many ways you can do it. You can do it using pseudo classes. You can do it using a extra div box. You can do it using blending modes, like inside CSS. There's many ways you can do an overlay like this. And I think the best way for us to do it is just to kind of go inside our HTML, and inside each of these containers, right before the h3 tag, I'm just going to go ahead and include a div box. So I'm going to create a div, and I'm going to give this one a class. And we're just going to name it something like dark-overlay. I'm going to copy this, paste it inside the other boxes down here. So we have 4 of them in total. And I'm going to copy the class name, save the document, go inside my index.css, and down below, right before the h3 styling, I'm just going to go ahead and say that I want to reference my dark overlay div box. And in here, I want to make sure that this one div box takes up the entire spacing inside this container, but it should also not affect any of the content inside this container here. So it shouldn't push around the h3 that we have down here. It should just kind of like subtly be inside the background of the text, but in front of the background image that we have inside the actual container here. So the way we can do that is we can add a position. And we can set this one to absolute, because that is going to allow for us to stretch out this container to wherever we tell it to. So I'm going to say that we want to take it all the way to the top of the container, so 0. And we want to go all the way right, which is 0. Want to go all the way bottom, which again is 0. And all the way left, and 0. I also want to give this one a background color. And you will notice something here when we do actually get done with this and actually refresh the page inside the website. It is not doing what we want it to, because it's supposed to fill up each of these little boxes down here. But if I were to refresh it, you can see that all of a sudden, whoa, okay, so something's going on up here, like it's not down there. And that's because right now it's not actually seeing our boxes down here as being the container that it has to stretch out inside of. So even though if I were to go inside my HTML here, you can actually see that the div box is inside our anchor tag. So why isn't it registering that one as the box? It's like going outside instead. That is because we don't actually have a position set inside the container that we want it to register as being the container. It needs to stretch out in. So if we were to go back up inside our box, which is up here, I can actually set a position. set it to relative, because that is not going to do anything other than set a position relative, unless we actually go down and start doing things like setting a top and then setting 100 pixels or something. This is not going to do anything. It's just going to have a position relative set, but it's not going to do anything. So I can go ahead and save this, go inside my website, refresh, and then you'll notice that, oh, now it registers these boxes down here as being the parent container. The next thing we need to do is make sure the text is actually showing on top, and we can do that with a very simple piece of CSS styling that we have talked about before. If I were to go down inside my text here, I can set a set index and set this one to something like 100, because right now these do not have a set index, so they're not really going to be registered as anything. So if we were to do this, go back inside, refresh, you can now see that we have web development, movie production, film editing, and Photoshop being on top. And now it's just a simple matter of actually adding a opacity to our overlay. So right now, as a default, what do we want this to have as an opacity? Well, I could go inside here and say I want to add a opacity and set this one to 0.5, just to give it something, just to test it out. If I go back in here, refresh, you can now see that, oh, okay, so it's not completely black. It's just like, it has an opacity and it's just kind of like darkening things a little bit. And this is a very good way of doing it, instead of having to go inside Photoshop and create a dark version of the background images and a light version, and then we swap out the images and then we have to preload them like we learned before. If there is a way to do it without having to load in additional images, you know, for hover effects and that kind of thing, it is better to do it just using CSS. So now what I want to do is I want to have that feedback when I hover my cursor on top of these different boxes down here. So what I'll do is I'll go back in here. And now you're going to learn something new when it comes to like pathing to certain things on hover effects. Because when I go inside my website and put my mouse cursor on top of the parent container, which is the anchor tag right now, then I want something inside the anchor tag to change. So how do we do that? What I can do is I can go up and I can take the path to my parent container, which is index category box. And what I can do is I can say, when I go inside this parent container box here and I hover on it, then I want something else to change. So I can go afterwards here, after the hover, I just click space, and then I add in the path to whatever I want to change. So in this case here, I want dark overlay to change when I hover. So doing like this, going inside my styling and setting a new opacity, which in this case should be 0, because I don't want to have any opacity on this overlay. I can now go back inside the website, refresh it, and then you can see we now get some changes going on in here. Now it is quite sudden that I don't want it to be this instant whenever we hover on top of it. So what I can do again is to go back in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and add a transition. So we're going to say transition. I want to set it to all to make sure that all the different changes inside our hover is going to happen with the transition. I want to set the type of transition. So this one is going to be ease in and out. And I do also want to set a timer. So in this case, we can just say 200 milliseconds just to test it out. So saving this, going inside the website, refreshing, you can now see that we get this smoother transition going on. So, you know, when we hover, it's not like instantaneous. It just kind of like does it slowly, and we get this cool little effect going on here. And in this sort of sense, I think it makes sense that we can actually see the different category names. And then when we hover on top of it, we can get a slight preview on the background on what does he mean by film editing? And then we go down and, oh, okay, so we have Adobe Premiere in the background here, so we can actually see that he means like editing stuff, you know, for movies. Photoshop, oh, so we mean the Photoshop program, because we can see that in the background. So, you know, just a fun way to sort of show the background images in a cool way using CSS. I think is kind of neat. Again, you can mess around with this as much as you want. If you don't want it to be this dark when it comes to the opacity at the beginning, you know, when you're not hovering on things, then you can just change it if you want to do that. So you can do as many things to this as you want and get any kind of result that you want to have for your website. That's all I want to show in this video. So I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next video.